Sometimes there is a model that will stick in your memory and will forever be something that you reflect on throughout your modelling journey. Not because it was necessarily your first kit, or one where you achieved good results using a new technique, but simply because it just caused you so much hassle that it haunts your nightmares. This kit is one of those. Join me in this video as I build and review the Mistercraft PZL-37B in 1/72 scale. As usual, before I start the video, please remember that adult supervision may be required due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. For a more in-depth look at the contents of the box and the quality of the parts, I made an unboxing review video on that, so take a look at that one. This video will primarily focus on the build and the finished model. As is usually recommended with plastic model kits, the first thing I did was to give the plastic parts a wash in warm soapy water to help remove any dirt or oils left over from the moulding process. This will help give a good clean surface for paints and glues to stick to. These parts were then left to air dry. Throughout this build I will either use my snips or a knife to remove the parts from the sprue. The rough areas and flash can then be cleaned up using a sanding stick or carefully cut away. The cockpit components are the first parts to be cut from the sprue and cleaned up. I used Revell contactor cement to glue these parts together. There is a large main floor area and then some smaller parts such as seats and controls which get glued onto it. These arch-shaped parts are bulkheads and also get cemented onto the internal floor. The various controls for the pilot need to be attached to their own little floor part first, which I used Tamiya extra thin cement to do this. This glue flows into gaps much better than the Revell cement and is easy to apply using the included brush. With the pilot's area now finished, it was installed onto the main floor. There are some internal details which need to be cemented into one half of the fuselage. These consist of instrument panels, ventral gun and an upper rear gunner's chair. The details, although welcome, are somewhat crude and have a slightly odd fit. This will become a running theme for this kit as we progress. With that done, the previously assembled floor area can now be glued into the same half of the fuselage. Tamiya extra thin cement was run along the seams to help them bond together. Humbrol 106 Ocean Grey matte acrylic paint was thinned with Tamiya acrylic thinners X20A at a rough ratio of about 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. This will help the paint flow better and avoid leaving visible brushstrokes when it dries, whilst also decreasing the drying time. A few thin coats might be needed though to give a good uniform layer of paint. I painted this on all the internal areas of the fuselage with a medium brush to get good quick coverage of paint. With that paint drying, Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey acrylic was used on the rear ventral machine gun and the control panel, taking care to avoid the previously painted areas. Humbrol 29 dark earth matte acrylic was used on the upper rear gunner's chair and the pilot's seat at the front, again taking care to avoid placing it anywhere it shouldn't be. The fuselage can now be carefully closed up and Tamiya cement run along the seams. You might find you need to use tape or clamps to hold these parts together until the cement cures. When the fuselage has dried, the front gunner's seat component can now be cemented into the open nose of the model. The horizontal tail surfaces come in 2 parts, an upper and lower section. These need gluing together. It's worth noting that this kit comes with parts for an earlier single tail version or a later twin tail. This particular model will require the twin tail, so the other parts can be saved in the spares box. The tail should plug onto the end of the fuselage, but I found that there was absolutely no way that it was going to do that. I ended up cutting off the plug and sanding it smooth. This took a bit of work to get it to look right, and then, with that done, the tail could be cemented onto the fuselage. I had to make sure it was level and didn't twist as it dried. I tried to then attach the vertical stabilizers onto the tail, which should slot over the ends of the horizontal part. Although they do, again the fit is less than great. And whilst doing this, the tail fell off the fuselage, so I would have to cement it back on in a minute. The wings come in two halves which need cementing together. There was quite a lot of flash on these parts which needed to be removed to make sure they actually fit together properly. With that done, cement was applied and the two halves pressed together. There was still quite a lot of flash that needed to be removed on the outer areas of the wings, so using a knife I carefully scraped it away. Final finishing was done with a sanding stick. The wings can now be cemented into the slots in the fuselage. This goes okay, but again, the fit is not great. There are some small components which look like radiators, and these get cemented to the leading edges of the bottom of the wings. There wasn't really much guidance on where these should go in the instructions or in the moulded lines on the model, so I pretty much used my best judgment. The tail wheel can now be cemented into the hole in the tail of the aircraft. Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey made a reappearance here and was used to paint the machine guns, which was still on the sprue. The engines come in a number of parts, with the main part being cemented into a cylinder which will attach to the nacelles in the wings. Again, flash will need to be removed, and the fit is questionable. The moulding of the engine detail is not great either, being somewhat simplified. Some small detailing parts such as exhausts and air intakes can be cemented on before the whole engine assembly is glued to the wing. I decided to try and do some pre-shading on this kit. There are raised rather than recessed panel lines on this model, so a wash, like I normally use, won't really work to bring out these details. Instead, I applied Humbrol 33 matte black acrylic onto these panel lines. I thinned the paint to help it flow better, and it was my hope that when the camouflage paint is applied over the top, it will help give some shading to the panel lines. Humbrol 247 RLM 76 light blue was thinned and then brushed onto the underside of the model. This is to represent the lighter blue colour used as part of the camouflage scheme. It might not be exactly correct, but I was doing the best with what I had available. A number of coats would be needed. Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey was now used to paint the engine areas. Humbrol 72 khaki drill matte enamel paint was thinned with white spirit and used on the upper surfaces of the aircraft. I would prefer to use acrylic instead of enamel, but I didn't think I had a suitable colour in an acrylic paint. Since finishing this model, I've seen some models of this aircraft in a lighter green and others in a more brown finish. This paint was chosen based on its similarity to the colour in the instructions, so again might not be quite right, but it's the one I went with. A number of thin layers of this paint will be needed. Whilst that dries, this cheap metallic silver spray paint was used on the propellers, wheels and landing gear components, which were still on the sprue. In a side-to-side motion, I ensure even coverage of the parts. I do most of my spray painting outside to help protect my lungs, so make sure you use the relevant protective equipment and a suitable environment if you undertake this activity. The landing gear covers had already been painted with the same blue colour as the underside of the aircraft, and I had masked them with tape before spraying them silver. With the paint dry, I removed this tape to reveal one silver side and one blue side. Humbrol 11 acrylic silver was used to paint the landing gear bays on the model. Had I planned this a little better, I could have sprayed these silver earlier, but I didn't think about it at the time. But that's okay, this step won't take long. I initially used Humbrol 53 to paint a base layer on the engines, but it should be a little more coppery. So when that layer was dry, I used Humbrol 12 metallic copper acrylic to go over the top to create a better effect. Next, with all the paint now dry, this Plasticoat satin spray was used to cover the entire model and act as a base for the decals. Whilst the spray paint was drying, I decided I would go for the Polish paint scheme, so cut the required decals from the sheet. There are also Russian and Romanian decals in this set, so you get a nice choice. Before I got around to doing the decals though, I thought it would be a good idea to get the landing gear in place. The main legs glue into their holes, with some little arms needing to be cemented onto each side and into their own holes too. I found this to be a very fiddly job, and again the fit was not fantastic. With that done, the bay covers can be cemented into place. Again, this was fiddly, and there aren't any locating pins or markers, so you pretty much have to guess when they are in the right place. I won't put the wheels on yet though. I'll leave them off until close to the end. Humbrol 29 Dark Earth Acrylic was used to paint part of the tail wheel. I believe this could be some sort of suspension, but I could be wrong. I used a fine brush to carefully apply this paint. The Plasticoat satin sealer was then used on the bottom of the model to help protect these newly applied paints and parts. Now it's time to apply the decals. I used my normal method of soaking them in warm water and allowing them to release from the backing paper. Humbrol decal fix was brushed onto the model in the correct areas, and this will help soften the decals and prevent any silvering. When the decals are ready, they are slid into place. The problem with the Mistercraft decals is that they are incredibly thin and prone to ripping. The printing is quite good, with small words being generally well reproduced, but ultimately these decals are not fantastic. You have to be super careful with them, and I can imagine a beginner having an absolute nightmare with these. I know they caused me a bit of stress. It's worth noting that the insignia on the top of the wings is supposed to be asymmetrical. Apparently this was an attempt to prevent enemy fighters from using them as aiming points and thus hitting the fuselage if it was central. The theory being that this would cause them to miss to a certain extent, but how effective it was, I really couldn't say. With the decals applied, a further layer of decal fix can be brushed over the top to help soften them further and look as though they are painted on. The spinners can now be cemented onto the propellers. This is relatively straightforward, but again, some removal of flash might be needed. Now I'm going to use this cheap matte spray varnish to protect the decals and give a uniform matte finish to the aircraft. The only problem I had when applying this paint was that I did it much too close to the model and applied far too much. It reacted with the previous paint layers and caused it to crackle. What a disaster! The worst area was on the tail, but there was a little cracking in a few other places too. I decided to carefully strip back the paint on the tail using a cotton bud soaked in enamel thinners, and then a toothbrush and flat-headed screwdriver to remove the offending paint. I then went back over these areas with more Humbrol 72 and hoped that the paint would level out. It sort of worked, being less noticeable, but it wasn't exactly amazing. I decided to use the satin varnish again to avoid cracking the paint and would just leave the model in a satin finish. I carefully painted the canopy frames using a fine paintbrush and the same colour that I used on the aircraft. Being enamel, I had to take more care. If I get it in the wrong place, it wouldn't be so easy to remove, as is the case with acrylics. The upper machine gun and mount were removed from the sprue and cemented together. The nose gun was then glued inside the cockpit canopy using some general purpose glue which would dry clear. Installing the upper machine gun was a bit of a hassle. It's supposed to glue into 2 holes inside the fuselage, but I found the part didn't quite fit properly. After some trial and error, it was eventually in there and I moved on. All of the clear canopy parts were glued into place using this general purpose glue. The cockpit, nose and rear gunner all need a clear part applied to them. Again, The fit of these parts was less than perfect, with some gaps being visible. The props can now be pushed onto the engines and they fit so tightly that I didn't bother using any glue. The hole in the landing gear leg needed opening up with a drill bit, as there was no way those wheels were going to fit in such a small hole. I carefully painted the tyres on the wheels with humbrol 33 matte black acrylic, taking care to avoid getting it on the silver wheel hubs. The outside wheel hubs need these alternative parts over the top, and these should be the same colour as the underside of the aircraft. They were carefully glued into place. Next, the wheel with the axle on can be inserted into the hole in the landing gear leg. Then the other wheel is glued onto the end of the axle. These wheels can turn freely if you're careful, but again, with the fit not being great, I wouldn't count on it. It's worth noting that if you wanted to display the wheels raised, all you'd need to do is omit the landing gear legs and glue the bay covers over the bays instead. No crew is provided though, so you'd have to add your own pilot at the very least if you wanted to display this in a flying pose. The aerial mast can now be cemented into the slot in the top of the fuselage, and that is as far as I'm going with this build. So, what do I think of this kit? Well, this one is probably the main reason I lost motivation for modelling not long ago. If you remember from my Zvezda Battle, Academy Mirage and fictional X-Wing videos, they were all Mojo builds. I did those after I did this one, because this just killed my desire to do models and it was such a pain. I've even been putting off making this video because of it. The mould quality is poor, with parts rarely fitting as they should, detail being crude and flash being present on almost every part. The decals are thin, prone to tearing and just hard to use. The instructions are a little vague, but generally not too bad. Some of the problems, such as the cracked paint, was my own doing, but a lesson learnt there. There are so many things that can be done to improve this one, such as filler to help hide all those obvious seams, and I know someone is going to mention that I didn't use any in this video, and there's a perfectly good reason for that. It would probably have been the end of the model due to the amount of stress having to fix all those seams, and it would have found its way into the plastic recycling bin outside my house. You could also add so many scratch-built details to this model, as it's pretty much lacking them all. Weathering would be great too, but I just can't bring myself to pick this model back up again to do any more work on it. Why don't we take a look at the positives? The model is cheap, retailing for around £7 or £8 in the UK. It won't exactly break the bank. You can get a finished model out of the box, albeit not the best plastic model kit version of this aircraft in 1/72 scale. I am aware that there is another one from a different manufacturer available out there, but it will cost you a bit more. The tooling for this kit dates back to 1983, when it was introduced by ZTS Plastic, a Polish model manufacturer, but the kit has been available in a number of paint schemes and versions since its introduction. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Mistercraft kits now. I love that they are so cheap and usually have very interesting subjects, but I hate that you're probably going to get something a bit nasty inside the box. That being said, I have seen a few nice ones too. Mistercraft tends to get access to model toolings and mass produce the kits on the cheap, which allows us modelers to have something to build, which I quite like. But I probably wouldn't expect to build a work of art from one of these kits. With this kit done now, I'm just going to move on with my life. As usual, let me know what you think of my build in the comments below, and if you would be tempted to get one of these for yourself. Honourable mention to my patrons over on Patreon, whose amazing support allows me to keep buying kits, paint and other things to feature on my channel. To find out what pledging your support means, and to join our growing community and get perks such as behind the scenes stuff and access to early videos, take a look at the links in the description. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and Discord. Again, all links are in the description. Oh, if you managed to make it this far, please consider subscribing if you're new here, and pressing that like button. Or, the dislike button if you didn't. It helps me out either way. All that's left to say is thanks for watching, and I'll see you all on the workbench again next time.